El día de hoy nos moveremos en un eje distinto al de ayer, pero que forma parte también de la agenda que el Aspen Institute en México y en muchos otros países ha considerado fundamental para el desarrollo. Tiene que ver con el emprendimiento y con la innovación. Qué bueno que podremos en el curso de esta mañana analizar estos temas con expertos, tanto del Aspen Institute como por algunas personalidades que en nuestro país también se han distinguido por impulsar esta cultura del emprendimiento y de la innovación. Iniciaremos con la conferencia que nos va a ofrecer el presidente ejecutivo del Aspen Institute, el CEO, Walter Isaacson. Walter es un personaje en los Estados Unidos y en muchos otros países. Un hombre con una sólida formación, graduado de Harvard College y de la Universidad de Oxford. Es un muy conocido y reconocido autor de biografías importantes. Ya comentábamos ayer su última sobre Steve Jobs, pero también ha escrito biografías formidables, por cierto, sobre Albert Einstein, sobre Benjamin Franklin y sobre Henry Kissinger, entre otros. Walter fue el editor de la revista Time y fue presidente ejecutivo de CNN antes de tener la responsabilidad que actualmente tiene en el Aspen Institute. Como suele ocurrir con los personajes vinculados al Aspen Institute, Walter tiene una gran autoridad moral y por eso ha recibido encomiendas delicadas, como la que le pidió hace algunos años Hillary Clinton para que presidiera un proyecto que se denominó Partners for a New Beginning, con la idea de atraer al mundo islámico a través de asociaciones público-privadas. Me parece una iniciativa muy audaz, delicada, y precisamente por eso se le encomendó Hillary Clinton a Walter Isaacson. O bien, como la que le pidió hace 2 o 3 años el presidente Obama para que presidiera el Consejo de Radiotransmisiones Internacionales. Bueno, se podrán dar cuenta ustedes por la naturaleza de estos encargos, de estas comisiones, por su trayectoria en Time, en CNN, ahora en Aspen, de quién estamos hablando, un hombre intelectualmente muy sólido, pero también un hombre de acción, y por eso refleja también de manera muy clara la filosofía y el espíritu de Aspen. Hay que reflexionar, hay que meditar, hay que discutir, pero también hay que actuar. Y yo creo que Walter conjuga todo eso, es un hombre muy inteligente, es un buen amigo de México, y por eso me da mucho gusto presentarles esta mañana a Walter Isaacson. Por favor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juan Ramon. I appreciate it. Yes, thanks. Thank you very much. And I want to thank Juan Ramon, but also Ricardo Salinas, everybody else who put together Aspen, Mexico. It started about 5 years ago when Harold Ickes, he's been around, I want to thank him as well, brought Ricardo Salinas, some other people, and said, we need an Aspen, Mexico. And Elliot Gerson, Melissa Ingber, sitting in the back, with the people at the Aspen Institute who put it together, along with Leonard Lauder, who was then the chair, he's waving in the way back there, who was then the chair of our international committee, and Claire Manana, who is now the chair of our international committee. So Benjamin Franklin, one of my biography subjects, used to say in his Poor Richard's Almanac that failure is an orphan, but success has 1,000 parents. There's 1,000 parents to the Aspen, Mexico, and therefore I'm sure it will be a success. It'll be a success because it's going to be part of the partnership we have with Aspens around the world. As Mr. Lauder said yesterday, it's not as if the Aspen US runs these things. We're all partners in a network or a federation. So Aspen Mexico is completely independent. We will learn from Aspen Mexico, and we hope you come up to the United States to learn from Aspen US. But it's a great pleasure to have you as part of our international network. As Juan Carlos said, there's a lot of very smart people who have been involved with the Aspen Institute. But his introduction, Juan Ramon's introduction, quite politely said about me that Aspen believes in not only thought, but turning thought into action and connecting it to creativity. That's what we're talking about in this conference in the past couple of days, which is the importance not only of great thinking, but great creativity. This is something that Mexico, in particular, with its rich culture, its rich arts, its rich sense of the humanities and history and painting and poetry and literature, brings to the world of technology, which is connecting the arts and engineering, the humanities and the sciences. And that is where I think creativity will blossom in the 21st century. I wanted to talk about the three people I've written about along those lines. Steve Jobs was the one. I had written all these biographies of Albert Einstein and Ben Franklin before. I hadn't quite realized that there was supposed to be a theme to the biographies. But fortunately, since Steve will tell you what you don't know in no uncertain terms, he told me that the theme of my biographies was something that made him want me to write a biography of him. He said that all of my biographies were about connecting the arts and the sciences, about connecting being smart but being creative. He said when he was a young man, he wanted to study arts and the humanities. But he became interested in electronics and technology. And so he met a guy named Edwin Land, who had started the Polaroid Land Company, one of the first camera manufacturers in the United States. And Edwin Land said to him, you should always stand at the intersection, that street corner, where the arts meet the sciences, where the humanities meet technology. He said, that's where creativity will occur. Some of you may have seen Steve Jobs' product launches, when he launches the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone. If not, go on YouTube. They're truly dramatic. Even Estee Lauder hasn't launched products as dramatically as Steve Jobs launched the iPad and the iPhone. But the last slide on the screen is always an intersection of two streets. It's the intersection of the humanities and technology. And he always gave the same talk at the end of his speech, which is it's in the genetic heritage of Apple and every creative company to stand at that intersection. I remember when I first met Steve Jobs, I was a very young editor at Time, a writer at Time magazine. I was the only one who used a computer. And so when Steve Jobs came in early 1984 to show off the original Macintosh, I got invited upstairs with all the top editors because they needed one person who knew what a personal computer was. And I remember how interesting Steve was. He was passionate about the beauty of this machine he had created, passionate about the case and the curves and the design of the curves. He told us that he'd gone to a department store and looked at a Cuisinart machine to see exactly how the curves should be made. He made us use a jeweler's loupe to look at every pixel on the screen and to show how the screen was bitmap, meaning that each pixel could be controlled to be any color. So instead of just having those ugly, most of you here are too young to remember, but those ugly letters we used to call ASCII text, which were just sort of green phosphorus letters that would come up on a black screen, the Macintosh could say hello and do it in calligraphy and script. When Steve Jobs dropped out of college, He actually stayed at Reed College, and he took only one course, and that was calligraphy. He said it was the most important course he took, so he could learn the beautiful writing styles and fonts. And so he was so proud of that Macintosh. But then he looked at us at Time magazine, and he told us our magazine was horrible. It stank. It was a really bad magazine. My boss sort of stood up and was a little bit upset. And I said, why? He said, because you should have made me Man of the Year last year, and you didn't. So with that passion came a certain arrogance in Steve Jobs. That passion for perfection led him, in some ways, to have what they called the reality distortion field. He just believed things because he wanted them to be true. Many years, I remained somewhat friendly with Steve Jobs. In fact, when I became editor of Time magazine, he was my best friend, probably 2 days a year, whenever he wanted something on the cover of Time magazine. But when I joined the Aspen Institute, it was about 2003, he gave me a phone call. And I said, well, Steve, why don't you come to Aspen and speak at the Aspen Institute? He says, well, I'll come, and he did come. I don't want to speak, but let's take a walk. I had done my biography of Benjamin Franklin, was just finishing a biography of Albert Einstein. And on the walk, Steve said, why don't you do my biography next? I must admit, my first reaction was, all right, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, you, Steve, your arrogance has not been reduced since we first met in 1984. So I said, sure, but let's wait 10 or 20 years until you retire. I'll do it then. That was a way of putting it off. But then somebody told me a few months later, a relative of his, said, if you're going to do Steve, you have to do him now. And I said, why? He said, well, he has cancer, and he didn't tell anybody. He's keeping it secret. But the day after he got diagnosed with cancer was the day he called you. So then I realized I would have an opportunity to do something very interesting. Here was a person, we don't usually get up close, those of us who are writers, biographers, get really close to somebody who has been in business and been creative in the world of technology and business. You know, we write about war heroes or football heroes or entertainment people or politicians, but to get up close to a creative businessman, and here was somebody who had transformed 7 or 8 industries. That Macintosh was actually the first computer you could bring home, take out of the box and plug in. It created the home computer industry. He does it over and over again. The way we consume music was transformed by the iTunes store, got rid of albums. Likewise, how we use music, the iPod. The iPhone transformed the cell phone industry. The iPad transformed publishing. The Apple Store transformed retail sales, and even digital animation in movies. Steve did it with Pixar. So I thought this is a great opportunity to show the connection of creativity to leadership and to values and to being smart. Also, in a larger sense, he was the innovation creation myth writ large. Somebody who had started a company in his parents' garage with a chubby kid from down the street and turned it into the most valuable company by market cap in the history of the world. So I said, fine, let's do the biography. And we started having long discussions so I could do this biography. It began when he made me walk the neighborhood where he grew up. A middle-class neighborhood. His father was a dropout, was an auto mechanic. And he showed me the house that they had lived in. And he made me look at the fence they had built around the backyard. And he made me put my hand on the back of the fence, the part you couldn't see. And he said, my father told me that we had to make the back of this fence just as beautiful as the front of this fence. And Steve had said, why? Nobody's ever going to see it. Nobody's ever going to know. And his father said, yes, but you will know. And Steve said that was my first lesson, that if you have a passionate care for what you're doing, for the products you're making or the services you're offering, then you will care even about the parts unseen, the parts that people won't see. Because a real craftsman, when he makes a chest of drawers or she makes a cabinet, doesn't put a bad piece of wood on the back facing the wall. Because that person, that craftsman knows if he puts a good piece of wood there, they've really cared about the product. And so when they were doing that original Macintosh, for example, the one I told you about that Steve showed us in 1984, right when they were finishing and all the curves were right, and that beautiful case he had designed, totally sealed because he didn't want people to open it up. A real artist doesn't want people messing inside their computers. He looked at the circuit board, and he said, well, this circuit board is ugly. It stinks. And the engineers on the team said, what are you talking about? Nobody's ever going to see it. Nobody's ever going to know. He said, well, the chips aren't lined up straight. Well, he said, it's in this box. It's going to be sealed. People won't be able to see it. And he told them the story about his father. And he said, you have to care even about the parts unseen. He made them hold up for 6 weeks, shipping that original Macintosh until they made the circuit board inside beautiful, with all the chips straight and equally spaced. And when they finished, he had them take a whiteboard with little pens and sign their names, all 30 of them on the original Macintosh engineering team, all the men and the women on that team. And in the middle, he signed his name, Stephen P. Jobs, all in lowercase, and they engraved it on the inside of the case of that Macintosh, where nobody will ever see it and nobody will ever know. But he said, real artists sign their work. So that's what I learned from Steve, was having a passion for connecting the artistry in you to the products you made. He said there are 2 ways of doing business. One is you focus on making a profit. And if you do, you might make a profit for a while, but you won't make a great company that'll last forever. He said instead, if you focus on making products, really great products, the profits will follow. But in the end, you'll have a company that'll last for generations. And that's what he was able to do at Apple. Over and over again, he has that passion for putting the product ahead of all considerations. I mentioned that he had what was called the reality distortion field. Those of you who remember the old Star Trek episodes may remember the early ones where the aliens could conjure up a whole galaxy just out of sheer force of will. It was called the reality distortion field. So the people who worked with Steve named his ability to do things like that the reality distortion field. He thought he could bend the laws of physics if he really wanted to, just by willing it hard enough. It started even before Apple, when he and Steve Wozniak, that kid from down the street I mentioned, were working at Atari. Steve Jobs was working on the night shift. He had dropped out of college, he had gone to India to find a guru. The guru had told him to only eat fruits and vegetables, no grains, no wheat, no meat, no protein. And Steve came back to Atari. When he got the job, he told Al Alcorn, wonderful guy, chief engineer at Atari back then, that if you had such a diet, you didn't have to shower often or use deodorant. Al Alcorn, I remember him looking at me and saying, that was a mistaken theory, so I put him on the night shift. Anyway, that's why Steve was on the night shift. And he and Wozniak were supposed to make a game. If you remember Pong, you know, that ping-pong-like game we had, they wanted to do a single-player version of it that was going to be called Breakout. And so Steve says to Woz, you've got to code this game in 4 days because we got to get back to the Apple farm where they were working, hence the name of the company they eventually founded. And Woz says, I can't do it in 4 days. I mean, this is going to take me weeks, 2 or 3 weeks of coding. And Steve had taught himself to stare without blinking when he had gone to India. His guru had taught him to just stare and not blink. So he stared at Woz without blinking, and he said, "Don't be afraid, you can do it." And Woz is going, "Well, no, you know, you've seen Woz, he's kind of a teddy bear of a cat." Steve kept going, "Don't be afraid, you can do it." Woz said, "I got so freaked out, I went back to my workbench, worked 4 days, 4 nights in a row, stayed up all night, and finished the game of Breakout." Steve's reality distortion field drove people crazy, drove them to distraction, but also drove them to do things they didn't know they would be able to do. Over and over again, you see it. The original Macintosh. It took 78 seconds to boot up. Steve told the engineers, "You got to shave 10 seconds off the boot up time." The engineer said, "Look, it's elegant. You can't do that. I can't make the code better." Larry Kenyon, he told me the story. He said, "Steve stared at me without blinking and kept saying, 'Don't be afraid, you can do it.'" Kenyon said, "Well, I went back to my office, and after 2 weeks, I had shaved 28 seconds off the boot-up time." And even later in life, when he's doing the iPhone, he doesn't want it to have plastic on the front. He wants it to be really strong, beautiful glass. And all the glass they were making in China wasn't good enough for him. So finally somebody says to him, "Why don't you call Corning Glass up in Corning, New York? They know how to make really beautiful glass. Maybe they can make this type of glass you want, this smooth glass for the iPhone." And Steve met with Wendell Weeks, the CEO, and Wendell Weeks said, "Well, we had this process we used to use, we used to think about, but we never developed it. We never put it manufactured it, called Gorilla Glass." And they went over the formula, and Steve said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I want, and I want this much by September, because we're going to ship the phone by Christmas." And Wendell Weeks, who's a great CEO, said, "Well, I told you, we've never made this glass. We can't do it by September." I'm an old-fashioned reporter. I'd heard this story secondhand from somebody on the Corning board. I actually went to Corning, New York, because I wanted to see Wendell Weeks tell this story. He said, "It was amazing." Now, by the way, there's 30 years to the day almost he had done it to Wozniak. He said, "It was amazing. This guy just sat right across from me and kept staring at me without blinking and kept saying, 'Don't be afraid, you can do it.'" And Weeks said, "I know how to make glass. You don't." And Steve would say, "Don't be afraid, you can do it." After the meeting, Wendell Weeks called up a plant manager of Corning in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, and said, "I want you to switch over and start making Gorilla Glass." And the manager said, "Well, okay, we're making flat screen TVs. Maybe in 2 or 3 months we can start making Gorilla." He said, "No, tomorrow." And of course the plant manager said, "Well, we've never done, we can't start." Weeks said, "I just kept telling him over and over again on the phone, 'Don't be afraid, you can do it.'" The upshot is, turn over that iPhone there, every iPhone in your pocket, every iPad, every one of those devices that year and to this day has had glass made by Corning in America because of Steve's reality distortion field. Doesn't always work. People sometimes say, "Hey, I'm like Steve. I can browbeat people, do reality distortion." It didn't work for Steve on his cancer. He tried it on his cancer. Sometimes it doesn't work. You have to know when it's going to work. It didn't work on the iPhone 5 antenna. He kept saying, "No, don't worry. You don't have to coat the outside. It won't matter. You can't bend the laws of the Faraday field and have an antenna work that way." But usually Steve cared enough about the product and tried to be a real artist that it made Apple totally different from any company. I saw this type of sort of passion and love for things in Einstein, Ben Franklin as well. We biographers love to find that incident in childhood when a kid is 5 or 6 or 7 years old that helps shape them. Sort of the rosebud moment if you've ever seen the movie Citizen Kane. For Einstein, it was when he was sick one day and his father gave him a compass. Einstein was amazed because the compass needle twitched and pointed north. However he moved it, the needle would twitch and point north. Nothing was touching the needle. There was no physical force, no physical object touching the particles that made up that metal needle, but it kept pointing north. Now, you and I probably remember getting a compass when we were 6 or 7 years ago. We go, oh, look, the needle points north. How cool. And then we go on to something else, oh, look, a dead squirrel. And, we forget all about the compass and why it points north. Throughout his life, he was still trying to understand the relationship of an electromagnetic field, gravity, particles, a unified field theory, whatever it was, to figure out why does that needle point north. He's not a great student, runs away from this German school system, drops out for a while because he doesn't like the rigid way they're teaching, wants to be taught artistically and creatively, finally goes to a school in Switzerland. But as a runaway at 17, he's looking at Maxwell's equations, the equations written by James Clerk Maxwell that explain an electromagnetic field. If you look at Maxwell's equations, or if you're Einstein and you look at Maxwell's equations, they'll tell you something, which is an electromagnetic wave, a light wave, or radio, whatever it is, any electromagnetic wave, always travels at a constant speed, the constant speed of light, 186,000 miles per second or so. Whether you're moving really fast to the source of the light will go by you at that constant speed. Or if you're moving really fast away from the light, it'll still go by you at that constant speed. And Einstein at age 17 is doing a thought experiment. All of his things were creative thought experiments. He never went to a lab and did an experiment. He did it all in his head. He said, well, what if I caught up with a light beam? What if I rode alongside it? What if I went just as fast as a light beam and caught up with it? Wouldn't the wave seem stationary to me? He said, but Maxwell's equations didn't allow for that. It caused me such anxiety, I walked around in the forest with my palms sweating. Now, I know what was causing my palms to sweat at age 17 when I walked around New Orleans. It was not Maxwell's equations. But this is a guy who's still fixated on why does that needle point north. As I said, he wasn't a good student. He couldn't get into the second best college in Zurich when he applied, the Zurich Polytech. I tried to track down who was the admissions director at the Zurich Polytech who rejected Albert Einstein. But eventually he gets an undergraduate degree, can't get a doctorate because they reject his doctoral dissertation 3 times because they don't understand it. So he finally gets a job as a third-class clerk at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, Switzerland. Third class because you can't be a second or first class unless you're a doctor, and he doesn't have a PhD. So he's relegated to the lowest level of things they do, which is to look at devices that were there to synchronize clocks. Because Switzerland had just gone on standard time zones, and if you know any Swiss people, they tend to be really Swiss. They really care that it will strike 7 in Bern at the exact same instant it strikes 7 in Zurich. And the only way to synchronize 2 distant clocks is to send a signal between them. And that signal travels at the speed of light. Whether it's a light signal, radio signal, whatever you use, whatever these devices that we're trying to get patents used, they all use, a light signal or electromagnetic signal. And you got this third-class patent examiner sitting on a stool saying, well, what if I caught up with that light signal? And so he does a thought experiment. He says, if I'm traveling really, really fast towards one of those clocks, what looks synchronized to me will be different than for somebody who's traveling really, really fast in the other direction. They'll see the signal slightly differently than I'll see the signal. And from that thought experiment, he comes up with an imaginative leap, which is, I get it. The speed of light is always constant. But time, what is simultaneous? That's what time is. Time is relative depending on your state of motion. That's all the special theory of relativity says. And it wasn't some brilliance that made him smarter than Max Planck or Poincaré or Michelson and Morley, all the people studying it at the time. It was he was willing to be imaginative and think different, think out of the box. Every other physicist, including Einstein, had read Newton's Principia, the Bible of physics at the time. And the Principia starts with a paragraph that says, time marches along second by second, irrespective of how we observe it. And you got this patent clerk who says, how do we know that? How would we test that? How do we know that's true? He is just like the compass needle, just like why is the sky blue, something that puzzled him. He's questioning what you and I think are obvious. That time goes tick, 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 whether we're watching or not or whatever. And Einstein says, how do we know that? He's rebellious against received wisdom. Every now and then, once again, it's like the Steve Jobs reality distortion field. When I talk about Einstein, people come up to me afterwards and they say, hey, I'm just like Einstein. I nod, smile sometimes, and say, how? I said, I think out of the box, you know. So, you know, Einstein knew what was in the box before he thought out of the box. So that tends to help. But it was that creativity that allowed Einstein to be who he was. As for Ben Franklin had that same passionate curiosity, but he had something really special that I'm going to end with because it applies most importantly to both the values of the Aspen Institute and to the values of Aspen, Mexico that you saw exhibited yesterday. His curiosity was always scientific as well as artistic. When he was a runaway at age 17, and by the way, this is why I don't often get asked to do graduation speeches, because all of my characters run away at age 17. They're all rebels. There's actually some connection there. They all rebel. They all run away. They all drop out. Not that I recommend that to graduates, but it does save me having to give graduation speeches. When he goes, he's going to England to get printing equipment. He's run away from Puritan Boston, in which everybody has to follow the ideological line. And if you deviate from Puritan ideology, you end up having to, like, go to Rhode Island and form a separate state or something. So he doesn't like that intolerance. He goes to England. He notices that the ship's captains tell him that it takes one day less to get to Europe than it does coming back, something not explained by the prevailing winds. And so he hears about how the water changes color. He starts dropping barrels into the water at different depths and taking the temperature of it. And so he becomes the first person to chart the Gulf Stream. That's the type of scientific curiosity connected to our human daily life that made him a great technology innovator, but he connected it to humanity. The most obvious being the lightning rod, where his electricity experiments and even that flying of the kite in the rain are the most important electricity experiments of the time, but it also leads to the most useful invention of the time, which is the lightning rod. However, as I said, there was something more in Franklin, something even more than being a great innovator and a great inventor. And that comes from being that runaway from Boston, which was then, although perhaps not now, a very intolerant town. You had to be same religion, same background, same breeding to be part of any power in Boston then. So when Franklin comes to Philadelphia, he loves the city, a small city then, only about 7,000 people. But it had all different types of people. It had Moravians and Jews and Anglicans and Quakers. It had freed slaves, blacks. It had people of all different Presbyterians, the Germans, the Scotch, all in Philadelphia. And Ben Franklin is opening a printing shop in Philadelphia with a newspaper. And all of them had their different newspapers. The proprietors had a newspaper, the Anglicans, the Quakers, they all had separate newspapers. And Ben Franklin decides to start a newspaper for everybody because he said we should tie people together. That's going to be the secret of the type of country we're going to create. And he was a shopkeeper. which meant people came into his shop. He didn't care what religion they were. He didn't care, what backgrounds or philosophies or whether they were from Scotland or Africa. He just cared about running a business, a small business. So he started a club. The club was called the Leather Apron Club, sometimes called the Junto. It was a club for the shopkeepers and artisans on Market Street in Philadelphia. There are already clubs for rich people in Philadelphia, and they're even working men's clubs, but this was a club for what he called we the middling people, the people of Philadelphia who were the shopkeepers, artisans, tradesmen, who were going to be the middle class. And they made a list of all the virtues that you had to be a great middle class values. Something a little bit like the Aspen seminar, where day after day they would discuss values and how to apply them. If you've read the autobiography, you've seen the values. Industry, honesty, frugality. They're sort of down-to-earth values. And Franklin was kind of a geek, so he made a chart, and he marked off every week how he had done on each 12 of the virtues. And finally, one week, he had mastered all 12. That week, he had mastered all 12 of the virtues. He hadn't made a lapse or mistake on any of the virtues. And he showed it to the other members of his club, the Leather Apron Club. And one of the people in the club said to him, as Franklin reported in a friendly way, that Franklin had forgotten a virtue that he might want to practice. Franklin says, "What's that?" And the friend says, "Humility. You might want to try that one for a change." What I love about Franklin is he writes to his sister and in his autobiography that I was never very good at the virtue of humility. I couldn't master it. But I was very good at the pretense of humility. I could fake it very well. Now, here's the genius of Franklin. He says, and I learned that the pretense of humility was just as useful as the reality of humility. It made you listen to the person next to you. It made you try to find the common ground. And that was the essence of the middle-class democracy we were trying to create. Over and over again, you see Franklin doing that. We have passionate founders like John Adams and Sam Adams. We have smart ones like Jefferson and Madison. We have really noble ones like Washington. But Franklin's a person who can bring different people together. When they're doing the Declaration, they create a committee to write that declaration. Jefferson, Adams, Franklin are on it. You see them being pulled apart on the issue of religion. Jefferson begins a very famous second sentence of our Declaration with, "We hold these truths to be sacred." Franklin crosses out sacred and writes in self-evident. And he makes the point that we're trying to create a new type of nation based on rationality, reason, and the consent of all people, consent of the governed, rather than on the dictates of religion. But a sentence goes on, and they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. John Adams puts, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So you see them doing the balance, bringing people together rather than tearing them apart. When I was at CNN, I was researching that. And that very time I was looking at the documents, I'd come in one morning and they say, "Oh, we have a great Crossfire show tonight." There's a judge who has put the 10 Commandments on the steps of his courthouse in Alabama. A federal judge has told him to get rid of them. He's not going to do it. They're going to sit in the marshals. And I went, "Oh, good, Crossfire. Who's for the 10 Commandments? Who's against the 10 Commandments?" And I realized how horrible that was. I mean, that we in the press and we in the politicians were using religion to divide us rather than bring us together. And even late in life, when Ben Franklin comes back from France and England, and he's part of the Constitutional Convention, they're tearing themselves apart on the big state, little state issue. But Franklin offers the compromise to have a House and a Senate, equal votes per state, and proportional representation. And he gives a great speech. He says, when we were young tradesmen in Philadelphia here, we had a joint of wood that didn't hold together. You'd take a little from one side and take a little from the other until you had a joint that held together for centuries. And so here, too, each of us must part with some of our demands. His point was that compromisers may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies, something you've learned quite well in Mexico. On their deathbeds, every one of these people sort of exhibited the traits that I felt made them important. You know, it was about 2.5 years ago when I realized, and Steve Jobs realized, that he was not going to keep beating the cancer. So I talked to him about his legacy. And I said, you know, what do you feel is your importance, your legacy? He said, well, I think through my Zen training, I've learned that life is like a river, just like history is a river. People put really cool things that they've invented, great ideas they've come up with, services they've made. They put those things in the river. Their innovations become part of the river. The goal in life, I've realized, though, is not how much you get to take out of the river, because all of us can use those innovations people have put in before. But the goal is how much do you get to put into the river. That's what your legacy is going to be. Not how much you got out of that river, but how much you put into the river. And so he said, that's what I've tried to do by creating Apple and these products. It's just putting something back in the river of innovation. As for Einstein, in 1955, his aorta burst. He knew he had maybe a day or two to live. He's in hospital at Princeton. And all the visitors come. He does various things. But that last evening, after the visitors have to leave, he asked his secretary, Helen Dukas, to bring the papers he had been working on in his office at Princeton. And there were a few pages of equations. And that night he died, he just sat there, writing line after line of equations, making some math mistakes and correcting them. I went to Hebrew University, where the actual documents are, even though I'd seen copies of them, because I just wanted physically to be in their presence. And you can see after 9 pages, the pain starts getting great, and the handwriting gets worse. But he keeps writing page after page of equations that he hoped would create just one step closer to that unified field theory. A unified field theory that would connect electromagnetism, gravity, particle physics, or, to put it more simply, why does that needle twitch and point north? Till finally he writes one last line that dribbles off the page as the pain became too great. One last line of equations that he thought would get him and the rest of us one step closer to the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. As for Franklin, on his deathbed, during his lifetime, he contributed to the building funds of each and every one of the 35 churches and places of worship built in Philadelphia. At one point, they were building a hall for visiting preachers. It was a time of the Great Awakening, and all these preachers were coming up and down, and it was called the New Hall. It's right to the left of Independence Hall. It's still called the New Hall. He wrote the fundraising document, and it said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and listen, for we might learn something. And then on his deathbed, he's the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. So when he dies, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests of Philadelphia link arms with the rabbi of the Jews and march with him to the grave. It's that type of respect for different types of people. It's that type of willingness to bring people together that they were fighting for back then in 1776, and that we here in Mexico, North America, and much of the world are still fighting for today. Thank you all very much. You want 15 minutes of questions? Yeah, I'll just call on people if you want. Questions, comments, debate. Please stand up. Don't be shy, or I'll cold call on people. Yes.
Quien quiera hacer alguna pregunta, por favor, de manera directa.
Yes.
What biography would you
What biography now? Well, I'm writing something now, so I'll tell you about it. And I often get asked, and I thought you might, why don't you do a woman, too? And I'm writing a book now that's not exactly a biography, because I realize that we biographers sort of distort history a bit. We take one person and wrap it around that person. Most innovation, as you know, comes in teams. This is what the Aspen values are about. It comes from collaboration, right? So I'm trying to write about innovation in our digital age and how it wasn't just one or two people, but these great teams of people that produce the transistor, the computer, the internet, and how they work together. But it begins with a woman named Ada Byron, the Countess of Lovelace. Ada Byron, in the 1830s, she was Lord Byron's only child. And when she was growing up, her mother, Lady Byron, was not particularly fond of Lord Byron. You can read about Lord Byron and find out why. So, in order to make sure Ada did not become a poet, she insisted that she be tutored only in mathematics, as if that were an antidote to poetry. And Ada becomes a great mathematician, but she also realizes that mathematical equations are like poetry. They're just the good Lord's brushstroke for painting something beautiful in our cosmos. And so she believes in what she calls poetical science, which combines, like I said, the humanities and the sciences. And she has a friend, Charles Babbage, who creates a calculating engine called the difference engine, and then is building a new one called the analytical engine that does, tries to become like a big old calculator. And what Ada discovers is something amazing. She comes up with the concept that if it can calculate numbers, it could actually calculate or compute any logical symbol. That it could do music. It could do words. It could process words. It could process, as she put it, anything that can be notated symbolically. And so that's the birth of the concept of the algorithm, programming, a computer that's programmed not just, how many of you, you're typing on an iPad, have you ever used that to do numerical calculations? To do differential equations or something? No, we don't use, we use our computers for words, for music, for everything else. That was her idea. And so she's sort of the founder, to me, of the creativity, the connection of arts and sciences in the digital age. So the book starts and then ends with her. Because the one thing she said two things. Computers will be able to do everything. And the second thing she said was they'll be able to do everything except think. They'll never be creative. They won't be like humans. They can't originate thought. Alan Turing, who comes along 100 years later, says, how do we know that? Comes up with the Turing test. It's very complicated. But this notion that creativity of humans is going to be essential, not just now, but forever, in an age of digital machines, that's Ada's concept. Yes?
The biographies that you've written have a mixture between technology and the human part of this.
Right. I'll repeat the question, yeah.
What do you think about the comparison between technological evolution in the world and humanitarian evolution? Is there enough investment in growing as human beings in the human relationship part, or is it only investing people and the world in technology?
Yeah. The question was that you heard the main part of it, that I'm interested in both the evolution of technology and of humanism. The whole theme, especially of the book I'm now writing, is called co-evolution. There's a guy named Doug Engelbart, a while back, who comes up with the term that humanity and its technology must evolve together. And that the evolution of our morals can't get behind the evolution of the capacity of our computers and many other things. So far, we've been very good at that. We always think, okay, now we've invented genetic engineering. Now we've invented machines that can, do various things, spy on people. Have our humanities fallen behind our technology? I think that's the big question of every time. I will offer some words of encouragement, which is this is not a new question. By the way, Lord Byron had this question, Ada's father. Lord Byron's only speech in the House of Lords is defending the Luddites, which you may not know were actually a group of people following a guy named Ludd who were breaking the technology in England because it was destroying hand-woven, fabrics and the humanities and arts. And Ada thought her father was crazy to do that. Ada believed in the beauty and even looked at the punch cards that they were using in the looms to make the fabric patterns and figured out the punch cards could be used in Babbage's analytical engine to make weave patterns, as she said, of logic. So over and over again, we've had technology in our lifetime. Our lifetime, we deal with everything from the atom bomb to genetically modified foods, whatever. We've always been pretty good at connecting the humanities to our technology. I think we're capable of it. I think we will be able to do it, but it's something we have to keep focusing on, and that's what the Aspen Institute tries to do. Aspen Institute in the U.S. used to be named the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, and it looked at science and technology from a humanistic perspective. I think that's what you should do in Aspen, Mexico as well. Yes, way back there. I'm having a little trouble with the lights. I can't see everything, but okay, there's a person in the way back too. Hi.
Walter, I enjoyed a lot your talk. And when you were speaking about Einstein, I remember that he, in his office at Princeton, had a small blackboard where he had written, "Not all that can be counted counts. Not all that counts can be counted." And I wanted to join that thoughts with what you were saying about the intersection of arts and science. Yeah, and I think just a word more. We should, in my science, that is economics, I think we should not forget about that, having this intersection of science and arts, but also not forget about humanism. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a question that sometimes arises called scientism, which is where science believes it can calculate everything and solve our problems. And even pundits like, Nate Silver, who think, okay, in numbers, I can tell you what policies we should do. But there's certain things that, as Ada Lovelace said, machines will never be able to do. Even basic things, like should a man be allowed to marry a man? That's a moral issue that stems from the humanities, and it's an issue about, many issues there. It has nothing to do with numbers. Should we intervene to protect oppressed people in Bosnia, Crimea? You can't do that with numbers. So trying to make sure that science and empirical numbers tries to answer our questions, you can get in trouble. We have to nurture our humanities side to say, how do we make moral arguments? Harold?
Well, first of all, thank you for an extraordinary exposition. It's really, you're
going to be tested on special relativity later.
Well, your speaking ability mirrors your extraordinary writing ability. It seems on the surface a simple question, maybe it is, but when you look at the sweep of extraordinary people in the world, how do you decide on who you're going to write about?
Yeah, well, it sometimes just happens. I mean, I was at Time magazine and frustrated about having to write short and covering Governor Ronald Reagan's campaign. People were sending me all these pamphlets about the American establishment and how they were taking over in the Bilderberg Group and Rockefellers and whatever. And I asked my friend, who I think you know, Evan Thomas, who was a classmate and then colleague at the time, what is it, you're a preppy, what is this American establishment? And then we decided to write a book called The Wise Men, which was about how the American establishment created foreign policy. That ended in Vietnam, and I wanted to try to figure out, because they get called by Lyndon Johnson, the wise men, because they come in and tell them, get out of Vietnam. So I wanted to take the story from there and decided to do Kissinger. Kissinger was such a pain to deal with that after that I said, I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years. So, but also Kissinger was a great balance of power realist, and I tried to figure out who was a great balance of power realist in America. And Ben Franklin was the first. He plays France off against England and the Bourbon Pact nation. So that led me to Franklin. And then I realized, well, he was a truly great scientist, but nobody gives him credit for that. And I wanted to do a great scientist, so I did Einstein. So it's sort of serendipitous that way. I wanted to make sure this guy in the way back, who I keep pointing to but never can get the microphone. So, and then I think there's one up here. And I'm sorry, don't worry. You'll have to wave. There's one there, but I'm supposed to end at 10:30. So.
My question is related to the social innovation outcomes and the way we can measure it. Many institutions, such as the OECD, have developed methodologies to measure the outcomes of technological innovation. How can we measure the social innovation outcomes? Is there a valid methodology to measure it?
Look, I'm not going to answer in a long way because I don't know. I was actually asking the governor of the Bank of Mexico yesterday at lunch. Were you there? And so I was at his table, said exactly the same thing. He said inflation has gone down. And I said, how do you measure the cost of telecommunications in the inflation rate? Because telecom is going down, but people are spending more on things like instant messaging or whatever it may be. So, he gave me a complex answer. Look, even Greenspan and the governor of the Bank of Mexico had trouble. Alan Greenspan kept saying we were in irrational exuberance. It was hard to measure what technological innovation does to the economy. But the only thing I will say is this, which I do think I know from history. At every moment of history, including when Lord Byron is defending the Luddites, people think that technology destroys jobs. It means fewer jobs for people who weave fabrics, for people who do whatever. Technology that adds to productivity does not decrease the number of jobs in a macroeconomic thing. There's dislocation, people have to change jobs, whatever. But starting, if you want to, in the 1640s, you can look at every technological innovation and there are more jobs and a better economy afterwards. So I think that's the only thing we have to take as a given, is that we should not be Luddites and resist technology for fear that it will hurt jobs. Was it? And were you waving for a question, or are you telling me I have to stop? Okay. You have a big notebook. I thought you were giving me a time signal.
Thank you, Mr. Walter Isaacson.
Yeah.
May you speak about your dreams for us Mexicans? Thank you.
Well, I do think that for the first time in many years, the United States has as much to learn from Mexico and as much of a need for Mexico as Mexico has for the United States. We will be a unified North America creating great energy outputs, creating a great economy, and throughout North America, creating a political systems that respect different viewpoints and bring people together. So I look at the path that Mexico is on with its creativity, its technology, its innovation, but also its political system. And we could all look at the bad things, like is rule of law doing well here, here, or here. But I think we should look at the big picture in North America, is that we share not only values, but resources. And when it comes to dealing with China, Russia, other things in this world, our ability to have the best economy, be the best exporters of energy, and to understand that our political system can end up being better than the other political systems. That's the vision I have, not only for Mexico, but for the whole Aspen Institute family of partners. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, I want to introduce myself first. My name is Maria Garcia, and I come from an organization here in Mexico City. My question is regarding creative ideas to fix world problems. Since they read your credentials and they said that you know a lot about the Middle East and you've worked with them, I want to know what is your opinion about the conflict in the Middle East now and basically Palestine and Israel.
Yeah. Well, there are two conflicts, the Palestinian-Israeli and then the larger Arab awakening. I do not think it takes a lot of creativity to solve the Palestinian-Israeli problem. We know what the solution is. We know it'll be a two-state solution in which both sides show respect for the people in the other state and protect the security. We even know within 100 yards where the border should be. We even know how you're going to figure out how to deal with Jerusalem and rights over holy sites and autonomy. We know that a Palestinian state will have a capital in East Jerusalem. We even know how we're going to deal with the right of return, which is now it's going to be, people will be compensated, but the right of return will not change the nature of Israel. So we know the answer. They got to it at Taba. They got to it at Camp David. But what that is a failure of is not a failure of creativity, not a failure of the imagination. It is a failure of leadership. It would not be that hard for good, strong leaders who have done much tougher things. When Begin and Sadat and others are shaking hands, that was tougher. It would not be hard for great leaders to say, we know the answer here. Let's just get to this. And we can quibble over this area C or whatever. So sometimes it's not creativity that matters. It's the will to be a moral leader. I'll save the Shia-Sunni Arab awakening for another time. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, sorry, microphone there. Sorry.
Thanks. I'm a bit scared of falling into blasphemy here, but I have this big question inside my head. Why do we think innovation is good for humanity?
Why is innovation good for humanity? There's a wonderful line of Oscar Wilde, which is, I love progress, it's just change I don't like. I think innovation and technology are neither good nor bad in and of themselves. It's just how they're applied. Innovation tends to bend the arc of history towards many things. Let's take information technology innovation. It used to be you had to be a monk in order to make a book. You had to be a member of the church in order to read a book. You weren't allowed to read your own Bible. Gutenberg comes along, you have an innovation that allows people direct access to information, and you end up not only with the Reformation, but you end up with the rise of liberal democracy eventually. Likewise, the internet. It bends the arc of history, I think, to more and more people having more access to ideas, and even more importantly, to be able to spread their own ideas in the world. So, is that a good innovation? A lot of times it causes problems. It causes problems in the Middle East. It causes problems with somebody who may read a blog entry saying how dumb they are or whatever. But in the end, it personally empowers people and leads towards liberty and democracy. Likewise, as I said, innovations like the weaving loom, people are afraid it will destroy jobs. But in the end, it gives a higher standard of living to more people. So you have to go back, if you're an Aspen seminar type, to what values do we have? And the basic values are liberty for each individual, the ability of people to have the types of things that make their life enriching, a standard of living that makes them good. And so we can be, because we're very comfortable in wearing coats and ties in an air-conditioned room, we can be against innovation sometimes without realizing that maybe there's at least 1 billion people in this world whose lives will be made better if they have better food and better water and better communications. So I think we have to be careful of always loving innovation. We have to always connect it to the moral goal of innovation, but we also have to be careful of resisting innovation for fear of wanting to hold on to what we already have. But last question, I think. I keep seeing people moving around, so although I'm happy to keep going.
Do you think the lack of an immigration reform will affect innovation in the U.S.?
Lack of immigration reform is just it's a moral and economic and political failure of the United States. It will hurt the economy. It will hurt who we are as a nation. And it will hurt our democracy. And it probably won't help the Republican Party. But it's a side issue. I will say this. People are always this way in times of bad economic times. The know-nothings, you know, in the 19th century arise during the recessions of the night. They're trying to stop the Irish and the whoever coming into the United States. So we've seen that in bad economic times. And you almost can, you shouldn't excuse it, but you can understand when people are hunkered down, they're a little bit more defensive. We are coming out of a bad economic time. It is now the time to be more open. It will happen. The question is whether it's this year or in 2 years or in 4 years. But this is intrinsic to America's economic interests and to its moral values. Thank you all very much. Oh, sorry. I get 2 more questions. You thought you were rid of me. Okay, way back. I'll make them short. 2 way back people. And then the woman in green behind. Yes, yeah.
Well, you talked about the experiences these great innovators had that changes their lives in when they were 6 or 7 years old. Which is your experience? What did you live to?
Maybe I had no such experience, which is why nobody will ever write a biography of me. I did have an uncle who was not a famous writer. In fact, most people wouldn't have heard of him, but became famous enough. A guy named Walter Percy, who was a novelist out of Louisiana. And I never quite knew when I was growing up what Uncle Walker did, because people called him Dr. Percy, but he didn't practice. He had been a medical doctor, didn't practice. He just drank bourbon all day long, as far as I could tell. And then when I was about 9, his book came out called The Moviegoer. And I realized, oh, he's a writer. And a writer was something you could be in life, just like being an engineer or a doctor or a fisherman or whatever. And I thought, well, that's cool. And then I read The Moviegoer, tried to, carefully, and I realized that there were certain moral and even spiritual and religious messages in it. And so I pressed Uncle Walker, what are you doing? You know, what are these spiritual messages? And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, there are 2 types of people who come out of Louisiana, preachers and storytellers. He said, for God's sake, be a storyteller. The world's got too many preachers. So that was a lesson, actually, which is that I may not be Einstein and not even Steve Jobs or Ben Franklin, but storytelling can actually help bring people together and understand the values we share. And so at that point, I said, that's what I'll be in life. I'll be a storyteller.
Well, about this genius that you talked about, we see here in Mexico that sometimes entrepreneurs get in this intersection of humanity and science or technology and to get innovation, but sometimes they stay just there. Which advice could you give that they could develop their idea or the product? And it's about opportunity, it's about time with the right people. What do you think?
Well, I think each of us has our own ambitions in life. And one of the things you do as a storyteller is you try to say, look, here's a guy whose dad was a dropout, who walked around, you know, in a middle-class neighborhood, but really cared about the beauty of the fence in the backyard, and cared about calligraphy and how you write, and cared about, to get to an earlier question, making innovations that will empower other people to be creative. That's what the personal computer was all about. It's an innovation, but it wasn't just for the sake of making more money or whatever. It was other people will be able to do things, and they will be individually empowered. And if you believe that's a deep moral value, that what you do in life should help other people be empowered to attain their own goals, and that's one of the beliefs I have, and I think we share as an Aspen community, then you say, okay, I want to do something in life. If you don't, the world, has billions of people. Not everybody can be a Steve Jobs, but everybody can aspire to say, I'm going to do just a little something. Come up with some innovation or some service or some way of helping people that allows everybody to just have a slightly more power over leading a fulfilled life. Thank you all very much.